Welcome to our lecturers and students. Today in ArchiDesign Talk, our guest is Gökhan Karakuş. I would like to introduce him first. Gökhan Karakuş is an Istanbul-based designer, curator, business strategist, historian, architecture critic, and theorist who focuses on the indigenous in modern architecture and design. He studied architectural history and theory at the Columbia University and Vassar College in New York. And he is the founder and director of Emedya Design, an interactive and environmental design studio that produces design projects, exhibitions, publications, and research in the areas of environmental graphic design, architecture, computational design, craft, and design history. As a critic, he is a regular contributor to leading global publications on architecture, such as the Architect's Journal, Detail, Architectural Record, Duel, and Wallpaper from 2011 to 2015. He was the Editorial Director of Natura, Stone Architecture, and Interiors. Currently, he focuses on architecture in stone and biophilic design. And Gökhan Karakuş, the speech is yours. Now
Thank you. Bunu İngilizce yapıyorum değil mi? İngilizce yapıyorum. I'm doing this in English. Okay. Okay.
All the presentations.
Okay, they're all English, so you guys learn important English. So thank you very much to Elçin Hoca, Bilgen Hoca, and thanks to Murat Babadav for the invitation to talk to you all today. As Bilgen Hoca said, I have a background in architectural theory and history, so I bring a lot of theoretical approaches to what I've been doing in my design work. To be honest, some of this design work, I've worked in areas such as user interface design and website design for many years. It didn't really apply to what some of the theories, but lately, over the last 10 years, I've been trying to pull all this stuff together. And today's discussion will be in part based on this attempt on my part to pull some of these ideas together within the scope of biophilic design, which I'm going to explain to you today. So today's lecture is entitled Biophilic Design and Architecture in Stone, and I will try to show you through some theoretical works and some approaches how all this is kind of organized and done. So hold on, so page down. So most of us kind of are living in this kind of world today. This world is a world of urbanism. Most people today live in cities, and the nature of this urbanism tends to be density is one of the key propositions. We live in very dense cities, and this density creates darkness. It creates lots of surfaces that are, as you can see here, made from concrete and made from steel. So these are the dominant materials, asphalt. The geometries are fairly regular and geometric. Most of us go around in subways and metros and these kind of things. So, this is the world that we occupy and live in. And at human scale, we are kind of smaller smaller units, so to speak, in this kind of urban world. We're operating at even suburban scales, at huge scales. And the human being is increasingly becoming a very smaller part of a very urban, very dense scale. This has caused certain reactions. Even in Turkey and Istanbul, we can say there's something similar. Many of us lived in these kinds of buildings, apartment buildings. One has to say that Istanbul, from being a not so dense city, is increasingly getting dense. We're all kind of aware of this. And some of our other cities are getting this dense. You can still see some trees, some foliage, things like this. But the level of urban development has been quite high, and from examples like you see here in Bursa, where the scale just changes, and you have this discrepancy between a kind of old world, middle world, and new world. A new world of modular, rational, steel and glass with reinforced concrete, and this kind of older world of a smaller scale. Gecekondu's in Istanbul being still, an example of how people are living. If anybody lives in Bomonti, we can see this kind of Istanbul. This is an example from there. What kind of effect does this have? This is something that most of us in architecture are not very well aware of. But when I was going to school in New York in the 80s, it was a time when this idea of environmental psychology had started. So environmental psychology was looking at how people react psychologically to their environment. And it's something that architecture and design has been kind of reluctant to use. But we know that, this is an article in Turkish, but we know that this kind of urban development has negative effects on both the human body, physically and mentally. So why? Because we as human beings, Homo sapiens, for basically 200,000, 300,000 years, we were like wandering around these kind of places. Right? This is the savanna of East Africa, and this is the beginning of Neanderthal Homo sapien life. Occurred for many, many years in this place. For many, many years, I'm saying, we know that human civilization is maybe 15,000 years. For about 200,000 years, we were living in this kind of environment. And the light, the orientation of us, of the human being at scale, kind of occurred initially in this kind of environment. This is part of environmental psychology. It's called the savanna theory, about how Homo sapiens kind of evolved, and the human brain, understanding of space, understanding of the environment was here in the savanna, was created. But today we live very much in this environment. We live in an environment where we are closed off in apartment units behind glass and steel, sometimes with these kind of security barriers. I think most people in this lecture would understand and know what this photograph is, because most of us are looking at these kind of things, looking at a window, at a gray wall of some buildings with very little visual access to nature around us. Or we are in public transportation like this, waiting around like this, crowding together like this. So these are all kind of the reality of modern urban living, and not just for Turkey, but for I think most people in the world who are living in cities. So the regular geometry of urban life is something that is part of our kind of reality. I took these off of just the side indent so that we can see this is fairly standard. So what's the alternative? It's not even an alternative, but what is actually the basis of all this? What I'm going to try to explain is based on this concept of biophilia. Right? Biophilia, it's first defined by the psychologist and social psychologist Erich Fromm in the 1950s and 60s, maybe a little earlier, 40s and 50s. And it's basically, biophilia is an innate affinity of life or living systems. It's our innate affinity to life or living systems. The opposite of it is called necrophilia, but I'm not going to get into it. So as I said, we're the product of bio. So this is my theory group of slides, and we're going to kind of go through some texts now. So part of what I do as an architectural theorist is to write a lot. So a lot of these things are based on my writing in this area. So we're the product of biological evolution, human preference towards things in nature. It's refined through experience and culture, but it's also part of biological evolution. It's evolution. Sometimes, we can see ordinary people, they risk their lives to save an animal. Like, how many of us have, driving a car, saw like a dog or a cat and, kind of moved our car around so that we wouldn't hit that cat or dog. And a lot of us keep plants and flowers in their homes. We have natural love for life because it sustains life. But we know that from history of the human being that, for example, why do flowers bloom? Because they indicate that the start of a process which involves fruit. So for our ancestors, it was crucial to spot, detect, and remember plants because they provide nutrition. So this is part of this evolutionary approach. So how can we apply this to architecture? Biophilic architecture, it's characterized by a kind of naturalistic dimension. So nature in all its forms, we take a look into. We look at the wholeness of the site, the basic structure of the place. And the key word here is holistic and also place. What is a place? And then we also look, and I think this is an interesting thing for me and part of my work, we look for a kind of geometric coherency, a kind of geometric configuration built around this humans and built around this natural environment, this connection as a geometric configuration. We're going to get into that also. Biophilic spaces, they strengthen life and support sociological and psychological components. When we talk about environmental psychology and designing in terms of biophilic design and architecture, we're trying to figure out ways to unburden our cognitive systems, support it in collecting and recognizing more information. And this is, I think, very important today because our cognitive systems are kind of an overload with the amount of information that's being thrown at them through smartphones, computers, etc. But also, we have to also think about our cognitive systems in the long run. The human body and its nervous system, was designed to perhaps last 60 years, 70 years. But now we're realizing it's going to last much longer. So these systems have had a load on them for many, many years, and it's going to affect, our later years, so to speak. So cognitive systems, sensorial systems, in terms of neuromotorial influence, we're trying to avoid both depressive and overexciting effects. We're trying to optimize sensorial systems, optimize how we're looking and engaging our environment in terms of light, in terms of touch, things like this. It should have a strong emotive and biological terms at a kind of neural level. There's been a lot of talk about neural systems and neural networks and neural this and neural that. There's a lot of talk, but in its basic organization of biophilic design, coming from its basis in environmental psychology, we're trying to understand how the human brain is processing its environment with all these visual, audio, hapto phenomena. Both at an emotive layer, that's emotion, what kind of emotions we have towards what we're seeing around us, and in connecting this biologically. And we can see that it's connected to clinical evidence and neuroendocrine system and immunological systems, especially for people in bad conditions. There's been a lot of, and I personally have been involved in the yoga movement, and in yoga we're taught to understand how we are reacting to our environment as a being, both in these kind of emotive terms. Now let's take this to architecture, and these are kind of different definitions about how all these theories of biophilia are applied. So this is one movement that I've been kind of part of. It's called biourbanism. So it's biourbanism. It's a participant and helping methodology. It verifies results intersubjectively, as people express their physical and emotional well-being, and objectively through experimental measures of psychological, social, and economic reactions. A lot of what I've seen in biophilic design and biourbanism is based on data. It's data-driven. We know that certain phenomenon, light, space, light, air quality, you can understand how it's a data-driven. So we understand through data how these certain exposure to light and air can affect us psychologically, and then henceforth socially and economically. When we're looking at biourbanism, we're looking at the work of people like one of my mentors, one of my key models is the deep ecology of Gregory Bateson, and his looking at this term and defining deep ecology, which I would encourage everybody to read, Gregory Bateson and his deep ecology. We're looking at the natural needs of human beings and how they're living in ecosystems. We're trying to also, as an issue of sustainability, we're trying to move the transition from fossil fuel towards new organizational models of civilization. This thing is not just something it's not a technocratic movement. There is a technocratic technical element in it, but it is also a philosophical movement. I was just speaking with Murat Babada about how we can talk about ecological philosophy. So there's that element. And we're also talking about the kind of organic interaction between cultural and physical factors, the geometry of social action, fluxes and networks, etc. I'll go through this quickly, but we live in an urban body. It's got many layers. It's fairly dynamic. It's very emergent. It's not very predictable. There's a lot of dynamic analysis. Everybody is aware of traffic in Istanbul. Traffic in Istanbul is not predictable. It's somewhat, it's an emergent chaotic system. So we need to approach that in that way. The city is really, it's a living environment of the human species. We live in very large groups. That's what human beings are. They're able to work in large groups. This is something cliched, spoken by Yuval Harari, the guy that wrote *Sapiens*. But it's one of the unique factors of the human being is that we can work. We work and we live in huge groups, massive groups, from this group that we have here of 10, 20 people, but we can work in groups up to 100,000, million, etc. So there's a kind of morphogenetic processes. So there's a kind of efficiency and balance there. So we're trying to produce a design that follows these laws, that's anti-natural, that's not anti-natural, and doesn't create hostile environments. We're trying to fit people in a life-enhancing way. And biourbanism acts in the real world by applying participative and helping methodologies intersubjectively in terms of physical and emotional well-being. So at the city scale, we want to create biophilic cities where the residents want to actively participate in preserving and connecting with the natural landscape that surrounds them. And we do this through not just design and architecture, but through frameworks of infrastructure, governance, knowledge, behavior, and these things that can create biophilic attributes. I know a lot of you, Istanbul specifically, we had this whole incident with the Gezi Park situation many years, and I think we can see, how this nature of governance and infrastructure worked in our city. I'm not going to go through this so actively, but basically it's, we have biophilic activities, attitudes, knowledges, and institutions and governance. So it's occurring at various levels. It's not just about giving a green space or a park, but creating a kind of ecological network. For example, walking trail, designating a certain part of the area for the city for vegetation forests, and then creating social movements around that in schools or community gardens, but at the same time, focusing on local ecosystems and governmental administration. So if you want to kind of look at the bibliography around this, Eric Fromm's book is a starting point. And then we have Stephen Kellert. He is a professor of social ecology at the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies. So he kind of brought around this whole idea of biophilic design. And then many of you will also know the work of Christopher Alexander, his pattern language, notes on synthesis of form, and his emphasis on the nature of order. So this is about ordering also, ordering both space and this kind of ordering goes from micro to macro. It goes from like your human scale all the way up to city scale. And then there's a mathematical element. Nikos Salangaros, he's a professor of mathematics, architectural theorist, urbanist, and consulted on biophilic design, human scale urbanism. He's one of our key writers in this area. And then there's a group in New York called the Terrapin Bright Green Group. Much of the stuff you see here and much of my application of biophilic design is based on their work. Also, other types of bios. There's bio design, which you can see in London in the Bartlett School of Architecture. Marcos Cruz is there. Bio design tries to work by putting together design with human-based design and natural systems creating, like mycelium and moss, these kinds of working together. The Institute of Advanced Architecture Catalonia in Barcelona has a biodesign group, and they work, for example, on similar issues with digital printing and fabrication. There's a group that I'm not so close to. It's the biomimesis group. This is actually trying to replicate in physical form biological systems at both architecture and design scale. We have in Germany, Achim Mengis at Stuttgart. In Norway, we have Michael Hansel and his partner, Defne Hansel. And then everybody will probably know the very famous Neri Oxman, who's a biomimesis. So this one, biomimesis, it's part of biophilic design, but I'm kind of more associated with biourbanism and biophilic design personally. This is a book by Kellert. There's also a film, so you can take a look at this film. So let's look a little bit about biophilic design, what it is. It's designing for people as a biological organism, respecting the mind-body systems as indicators of health and well-being. Good biophilic design draws from health, social cultural norms, past experiences, frequency and duration of the user experience, the speed at which it may be encountered. This is very, very important. I think many architects and designers do not account for speed. I am also a follower of the work of Paul Virilio, his dromology. He's a French post-structuralist theorist, and looking at speed. We have to imagine that the human being, up until, when he first got on a horse, the fastest he could go was walking. So, in the last 4,000 or 5,000 years, there was a horse, and then they got onto a cart, and then they got into a steam powered. So it's been very quick. I don't think the human brain has really processed what it means to go very fast. And that's another experience of that. So why are we trying to do biophilic design? We're trying to create spaces that are inspirational, restorative, and healthy, as well as integrated with the functionality of the place, urban ecosystems. And we're trying to nurture the love of place. I think many of us don't really like the places that we live in. We're trying to figure out how to make people love the places they're in. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about now these patterns. This is based on the Terrapin Bright Green group. So there's 14 of these patterns. I'm going to go through them with you very quickly here. As you can notice in this matrix, we have 14 patterns. And at the top there, these patterns, what's their benefit? They reduce stress, they improve cognitive performance, and they enhance mood, emotion, and our preferences. And all these little blue footnotes here are based on qualitative and quantitative environmental psychology analyses. So I think this is very, very important. This is not just about aesthetics. It's not just about style. It's not just about putting a plant in somebody's room. These are based on environmental psychological mind-body analysis. You can see here in this matrix, things from reducing blood pressure, improving cognitive performance. So these things have direct effects, and you can look at these footnotes to figure out why. So we have 3 groups. We have 14 patterns in 3 groups. We have the nature in the space, how we can bring nature into a space. If we can't do that, how we can bring an analog of nature into the space, and then the nature of the space. For industrial designers, the first 2 are the more important ones. The last one, which is nature in the space and natural analogs, and nature of the space is more architectural. So let's take a quick look at these. As I said, there are 3 groups. There's 14 of them. And the first group is nature in the space. So we're trying to create connections with actual natural things, natural bodies for various effects. So let's look at these with some examples. So first example, visual connections, pretty easy to do. You got some, this is a Japanese tea house, so they're set in a very forested area, and the way the architecture is arranged with orientation towards the views, you can see, you know, this view to an element of nature, a living system. Trees there, to the left, water elements. So the way the architecture, it frames these views. This is actually in New York City, in Manhattan. It's right in the middle of Manhattan. This is the New York Times building. And New York Times building is on 42nd Street and 8th Avenue, which I was there just recently. And it's a very dense urban location, but inside the building, they have these small courtyards where with these trees, which are, as you can see, very much creates an urban oasis in the city. So when you're walking around the New York Times building, you can have access to views of trees, using landscapes, the topographic organic landscape as a kind of nature in the space. You can also have non-visual connection with nature. You know, a lot of us in design are working in visual design, but there's also other senses. So non-visual connection, which is auditory, haptic, olfactory, and gustatory. And these are stimuli that engender positive reference to nature, living systems, or natural processes. For example, this is an example I like to use. This is in Venice on the shoreline there. Obviously, you can hear the sea, you can touch it, you can smell it, but importantly, you can also taste it. I don't mean like, you know, you can jump in and taste the seawater, but basically the water is kind of going in very small droplets into your nose and mouth, and you can actually taste it. So this is an important part of the experience of a place, is through these different elements. I myself, for example, I drop my daughter off at her school in Tarabya every morning at 8 o'clock, and I sit there and engage the Bosphorus looking for these non-visual connections. We've used this in architecture. This is in southern Spain, and we know that the Islamic culture there, with this use of fountains, sound, visually stimulated, trying to stimulate and create a connection with nature in the medieval times in southern Spain at Cordoba. We also have non-rhythmic sensory stimuli. These are what we call stochastic or ephemeral connections with nature. This is a facade of a building that is a dynamic facade. So when the wind comes across it, it creates these stochastic, means coming from chaos theory, means it's hard to predict how it be. The human brain cannot predict what kind of situation will be here. And it's kind of ephemeral. It just goes, just goes by very quickly. So you kind of don't understand, you can't predict it's coming or going. We can also see this in water. Istanbul, we're lucky to be living in lots of water. So when you look at the water, there's these ripples of the waves, but also the wind. And then there's also reflection off of there, which is ephemeral. Airflow and variability. This is something that architects take into account, but if you're designing interiors, which is air temperature, relative humidity, airflow across the skin, and surface temperatures. So you can see this terraced balcony, the architecture has been enabled so that it's going to have a thermal airflow in this terraced balcony space. But we can also see this in this double facade of a building. It's not such a great slide, I'll have to change it, of this building. I think this is in Spain. The presence of water is an important element. We have lots of water elements in cities like pools and fountains. This has been part of urbanism since Roman times. Before that, the medieval Turks in Anatolia, the Arab cultures used a lot of water. So the water, the important bit here is seeing, hearing, and touching of water. This is in London, a fountain there. But you can see how this integrated the water with the overall space, creating reflections, because you can see different aspects of the light there. Dynamic and diffuse light, the intensity of light and shadow that changes over time to create conditions that occur in nature. I want to just dwell on this quite briefly. There's a system of thought around what's called circadian rhythms, and we know that the human body, each individual cell, basically has a clock, and these cells, the clock is based on our understanding of the time, based on how we're seeing light at what time of day and also what time of year. We know that the light in the winters is more of an angular light, and in the summers it's more up and down light. So our human brains, in terms of our activity, very much deal with that. Architecture has used this in many ways. This is an art gallery with its top lit, so we have natural light brought to these spaces. The use of lighting is very, very important because of the circadian rhythm, and also the fact that in cities today, many of us do not have access to sunlight all the time. I moved from New York City to Istanbul, and one of the key benefits of my move was my ability to access sunlight throughout the day in the places I lived and worked. Connection with natural systems. This is natural processes occurring all the time around us that we're not so aware of. These are temporal changes of healthy ecosystems. You can see here, these are various plants in a kind of swampy condition. This is a slide I like to use. This is a terrace outside of an architecture office in New York City. And you can see the changes of the seasons based on how the terrace changes. We have in Istanbul a lot of these kind of permanent green structures. I know that the Istanbul Metropolitan Municipality, who I've worked with, Çağatay Seçkin, the Parks and Garden Department, have been trying to remove some of these 12-year, year-round green walls, and I think I'd have to agree with this. We don't want to, we don't necessarily want to see healthy green air around us all year. We want to see the change, the temporal change, and the changes of color, the elimination, for example, in the winter months, because these themselves it's a natural process, but importantly, this brings itself ecosystems. For example, there's a story that comes with this. This is outside of an architecture office, and in some of the months, this terrace attracted pigeons, and the pigeons attracted predatory birds like hawks and falcons. So while the architects were working and looking at the view, they would see like hawks come in and, kill a pigeon. So you were accessing this became part of your day, this visual access to this ecosystem of birds, predatory birds and pigeons. They would feed on them as the architect was trying to draw something on AutoCAD. So if you can't bring in nature, you have to bring an analog of nature. What that means is, indirect evocation of nature, non-living things. And these can be done by objects, material, color, shape, sequence, patterns found in nature. You can make artwork, ornamentation, furniture, decor, textiles. You can mimic things like biomimicry, shells and leaves. You can create furniture with organic shapes and natural materials. That's been a process like wood, plank, granite tabletops, which is what we work on, and try to figure out, while they're real, they can be analogous as not in a natural state. It's a way of providing information richness. This is an important bit. Providing in an organized and sometimes evolving manner. So we have three: biomorphic, material connection, complexity, and order. So biomorphic patterns, these are like symbolic references to contoured, patterned textures and or numerical arrangements. This is how I got into all this, is through numerical arrangements that persist in nature. You can see here, this is a ceramic facade in this kind of biomorphic form in a hospital in Mexico. But in the history of art and architecture and design in Western civilization, we have the work of Victor Horta in Belgium in the Art Nouveau, which was basically based on this kind of using organic forms. You can create connections through material. This is another thing that we try to do through minimal processing. You don't want to affect the material too much, and you want to reflect a local ecology or geology. This is what I've been trying to do. So you create a sense of place. So here we have bamboo, and here we have, for example, leather. There's a leather interior, and you'll see my work in stone. I have to do with this. Complexity and order, a rich sensory information that adheres to a spatial hierarchy. Spatial hierarchy is similar to those found in nature. And this is an important thing. This is this scaling factor. So here you can see on the right-hand side, this is a building by a guy named architect by the name of Santiago Calatrava in southern Spain. I believe it's the train station Valencia. So it's a scaling factor is more impactful when it's 3. So most modern architecture, you have 1 unit and then it's tiled out. So you have a factor of 2. If you can get a scale factor of 3, this creates a certain level of complexity and organizational complexity that is much more connected to nature. So this is something that I've also tried to do, and I'll show you examples. You can see this in how landscapes and nature work. And lastly, we have the nature of the space, which addresses spatial configuration in nature. It includes our innate and learned desire to be able to see beyond our immediate surroundings. Our fascination with the slightly dangerous or unknown, obscured views, and revelatory moments. My wife and I were talking about it. She said that she saw in this new Turkish television dizi, they were talking about the people in this television series. We're talking, and it's fictional, about how they all like to live, with places with views towards the distance. So we know this is from how our relationship and our innate desire to see beyond, see in the distance, coming from the Savannah theory. And so we want to create deliberate, engaging spatial configurations commingled with patterns with these other patterns. So what does that mean? We have 4 patterns here: prospect, refuge, mystery, risk, and peril. Prospect is the one I was just talking about. So going back to the Savannah theory, you're a human being, you're living in a group of other hunter-gatherers, group of like 20 or 50, you're walking around the Savannah. So you want to be able to know that in the distance, there are some like predatory animals. You want to be able to see them so you can run away from them, because predatory animals like lions and etc. would prey on your group because they're stronger than you. So this ability to see in a distance, and we know that you can see through architecture this emphasis on being able to surveil, and planning around that is this unimpeded view over a distance. It's part of neoclassical architecture, but it's also part of modern architecture. I got to get better slides. This is Louis Kahn's building, the Salt building in a Salt building in California, with this kind of unimpeded view of the sea. Refuge, again, this was also in this disease, this ability to withdraw, from environmental conditions or the main flow of activity, which the individual is protected from behind and overhead. So this is the Pueblo Indians in Southwest America. They live in these kind of urban settlements where the top and their back is protected, their rear area is protected. And this is a kind of comes from an innate need to protect our surroundings. And this is, I gotta get better slides. This is a walk in Barcelona on their shoreline, on the beach. You can see the unit there where, the top and rear area is protected. And lastly, mystery. Mystery is the promise of more information achieved through partially obscured views or other sensory devices that entice the individual to travel deeper into the environment. Like, everybody will know, you go out and you're walking in a park, or you're walking somewhere, and you want to say, oh, what's behind that tree, or what's behind that building? So there's a kind of innate sense to figuring out that mystery. You can see that here in how this terrace is organized to this kind of weave pattern. But it's also through landscape architecture. I grew up in New York City for some time, and after my college years and beyond. And you go to Central Park, or you go to Prospect Park in Brooklyn, The design is by the landscape architect Frederick Law Olmsted, and it's very much based, this is not a natural condition that was found. It's very much based on these principles. And landscape architecture, especially English landscape architecture design, is based on these principles. And lastly, risk and peril. This is kind of a weird design thing, but you can do, risk and peril to identifiable threat compiled with a reliable safeguard, like, looking down these railings. Like my daughter, for example, she has a fear of heights and she can't walk on these things. So because that threat is too much for her, even the risk. And you can use this in architecture, like this big stone thing. This is at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art. There's a stone installation. So you have this big stone rock hanging above you, but that's going to fall. But it does create certain reactions in your mind and body with your blood pressure. Okay, so that's two things. One, what's the bio relationship in our life today in terms of biourbanism, biophilic design, biomimesis, and in one theory group, which is what I'm closer to, biophilic design, what those theories are. And now I'm going to show you some of this, how I apply this, especially in architecture in stone and design in stone, through my work over the last 10, 12 years. And this work is a mix of projects that I've curated, projects that I've managed, projects where I have design work in it. So I work in groups. I try to work collectively with groups of architects, designers, artists. So you'll see, but I'm basically the guy that's kind of the chief strategist and moving the project along. So the first thing I want to show you is how we got involved in this, which is working in marble mosaics. This was a project we did in the early 2010s. I was working on trying to figure out how to work with advanced mathematics in what was called aperiodic tiling. This is tiling that does not repeat. And I was looking at medieval Islamic architecture for this. And we found this pattern, and we worked with an engineering group in London called Adams Carrot Taylor, and they gave us some of the mathematical principles of this. So basically what we did, our job of our office, and this is the thing we showed with Murat at one of our Alarmi exhibitions. So basically this thing starts off as a very complex mathematical calculation. And I didn't calculate it, but somebody did calculate it. And they gave us that calculation that created a geometry. And we took that geometry and we made this pattern you see here into various objects. So these objects retain the original complexity and order principles of an aperiodic tiling. So I'm not going to get into aperiodic tiling. It's a very long discussion. But aperiodic is aperiodic. It's not a regular tile or pattern, the one you see everywhere, which is a square tile, or maybe it's a triangular tile. This pattern is something that's quite complex, and it comes from mathematics. For example, this is a series of mosaics we exhibited in London and in Milan. And we tried to work here between this mathematical pattern and this patterns of nature, where this pattern in marble, this Eliza cherry. So this is our first experiments in stone. So these two patterns existing together, this kind of geological pattern with this mathematical pattern. And here we tried to make this at scale. So this is actually an attempt to work in 3 scales, from the unit here to the middle pattern to the larger pattern. So this is a scaling up of 3. These are quite thick marble panels. And they're also haptic. They're 3-dimensional. They're not flat. And these were made by hand, by craft, by local people. Part of biophilic design is to work locally. We exhibited these in London at the London Design Festival. And then later we exhibited them at the Istanbul Design Biennial. It was 2016. So this was our first major work. These 2 works here, part of that. You can see the pattern here, this exhibition at Strata Tiles in London, that pattern and how we extrapolated that pattern into local material, which was stone, but also made with craft, and also digitally. These were cut out individually about what water jet means. That's something I try to do in our work, which is combine craft and digital fabrication. Later, I got a job at the Memorial Hospitals Group to do some, actually, we started off doing this wayfinding. Our office does a lot of wayfinding, so we did this wayfinding. This is an interior by Zoom Architecture, Levent Çırpıcı, and Atilla Kuzu. And we did this wayfinding design here. We do a lot of wayfinding design projects based on placemaking principles. So we work with them to develop these totems and provide orientation. Wayfinding is inherently biophilic because you're trying to provide people orientation to where they are and where they can go. Because in the density and the scale of our cities today, it's so large, these cities, people get easily confused. So we're trying to give them a sense of place, which is one of our principles of biophilic design. But the challenge I was given was to actually create an art program inside of the buildings. We have these long corridors. So what I did was, you can see here on the left, I commissioned two artists to create large-scale landscape paintings. So this is basically, in terms of a biophilic design strategy, I could not bring in a large landscape in here. So what I did is an analog, so you can create a painting of a situation of a landscape. But I specifically gave the commission. What we did was I wanted to create a sense of place. So these places, I had the landscape there, Beyza Boynudelik and Ayşegül Karataş. They went out into bird sanctuaries around Turkey, took photographs, and then made a painting of that photograph, which you see here, bird sanctuaries. And then once they made the painting of the photograph, what we did is, Ayşegül is here, we took a photograph of it, and then we blew it up into a large scale, and then the artist came back and retouched the photograph to create some texture. So it involved a process of commissioning, curating, and then adapting it to the space. These corridors are quite long. So in terms of orientation, when you walk by it, like a person walking, you have to imagine people in hospitals are very stressed out people. They're either ill or they are with somebody that's ill. They're not in a good mental state. So you're trying to kind of make sure they know where they are. So when they walk by this, in terms of their peripheral vision, they're understanding, oh, I walk by this stone water element. So you can see this is asymmetric. It involves a time element. Like, it's impossible to see this work. I had a hard time taking some of these photographs because, for example, here, I had to combine it from two angles because it's impossible to see it from right across it. It's basically meant to be experienced over time, like a short movie, because I wanted the peripheral vision to be able to understand exactly, when you're walking in front of it, the birds are here, and then here there are no birds, or there's some water here and there's not water. So this is how I commissioned, and we work with the artists to create this. The second part of the project, and I'll show you this later, was to work creating some sculptural elements. This is some of our wayfinding. This is a what's called, this is a big sculpture element by Pin architects, Tuna and Fikret Sungay, Pin architect, and it's part of a competition I organized, which I'm going to show you. And then also we have No Studio, which is Candaş, Sisman, and Deniz, and they created a three-part waterfall, a digital waterfall. So these are together. I was more involved with this project. I'm a little bit involved with this as part of the curation of this whole space. This is the Biophilic Garden by Pin, and this started its life as a competition I did in 2017. We started initially at Studio X, and our sponsor was Akta, which is called Silkar Stone currently. And this was the winning proposal. It's done in a laminate marble. So one part of it is marble, and the other part is honeycomb. And it was meant to bring in a natural organic shape, but also kind of experience that whole mystery, like what's beyond that corner. You could say, well, it's not such a big space, but even in the small plaza with this very rigid geometry, there was an architecture competition where we invited young architects at that point. Melike Altınışık, Kerem Piker were invited to give proposals, and the winner from a jury of Han Tümer Tekin, Nevzat Sayın, Brigitte Weber was Pin Architects. And this was a two-part project. You can see here initially installed, and then later It had some bamboo elements, and these are all organic forms. We try to emphasize organic forms. That was completed, and this piece on the right was moved. It was bought actually by the Memorial Hospitals Group. And this piece on the left, they also sold, but this piece was very difficult to move. The architecture intention, when they were taking it apart, it fell, so it broke. So we only have one piece left of this. This is the next project that I'm going to show. This is a project, again, I was public space curator. So we had these very large retaining walls here on the left-hand side. This is in Kasımpaşa, Piyalepaşa. And we were the client, which is the Polat Holding, Piyalepaşa Development Group, asked us, how can we hide these walls? These are big retaining walls. Anybody who lives in Turkey today in a major city will see retaining walls everywhere because of the scale of architecture has grown. So this is in construction shots. We worked here with one of my ex-students, Ayça Budak, and her husband, Önder. Their office is called Mimari Studio, and they are experts in biophilic design. And we work with them to develop this project to create this geometry. Okay, again, on the right-hand side, a very regular geometry here, irregular geometries. And sometimes you can bring nature in. Sometimes you have to use organic shapes. Sometimes you have to use complex geometry. So this was done by Önder Ayça. In terms of these panels, we work with our colleague Nilüfer Kozikoğlu of Urban Atelier. She, as an artist, created these panels in aluminum and concrete and cement. These will eventually be taken over by these ivies. And there's also frozen algae. No, what is it? Frozen algae, I believe. So this project, it's an attempt to create a kind of biophilic space where sunlight, patterns, geometry, nature come together. These kinds of reflections of light on these surfaces, the complex geometries. It's meant to create a kind of oasis within this. This is actually a residential courtyard, some of our wayfinding here. And it's trying to create something more natural, kind of a kind of forest type, an analog of a forest in the middle of a city. You can see here that it's shot from a drone, these organic forms, and this melding together with landscape architecture. These are made, handmade. So, here on the right-hand side, you have the old cleaned up surface, but later on, this more textured haptic surface, which is done by hand by artists. And this is what is the end result. And the neighborhood behind is actually a lower income neighborhood. So you have this high income, lower income. And we're trying to also work with the existing architecture. There were these poles in the background as a fence. So we're trying to create with natural materials a geometry with that. All natural materials primarily, but cement and concrete, water element, reflection on water, things like this stone bit here. The second project we had there was again with Salih Küçüktürk pin. This is in construction shot. This is in Piyalepaşa. This is a park, which eventually became Gülbaba Park. You can see the organic forms here. And on the right-hand side, a sitting area with statues. And this is a very big, major avenue in Kasımpaşa. So we're trying to create a more livable, humane, humanistic place in the middle of the city. And our initial project was to create also a statue and artwork. And artwork is part of the biophilic process. So these are some renders initially. Our office did the design of the base pedestal of the statue. And these are our initial work in aperiodic tiling again, using Penrose tiling and ceramic, Iznik ceramics. And another thing we tried to do, and this is part of my interest in architecture and stone, we went to, so this area, I don't know if you can see it here, but back here in the corner, you can see this is a mosque by Sinan, Mimar Sinan, and it has a bunch of küfeki taş in it, which is a kind of local Istanbul-based limestone, so to speak. You can see parts of it here, but it's very much a local Ottoman Istanbul stone. So what we did is we went I went with my assistant, and we went to the quarry, which is in Arnavutköy near the new airport, and we picked out big pieces that we wanted to use on site. So what we're doing here is we're actually going into the quarry. We're picking out pieces that look kind of natural, but not. And what we did was we actually scanned them three-dimensionally. So these are LiDAR, so you get a three-dimensional scan. So that's what you get, but it's a three-dimensional model. And these are the various three-dimensional models of these. And then we took these mesh models, and then we tried to make designs out of them. In my office, Emedya Design, which goes to the Kabal Jaran. So we kind of made some propositions, but we didn't design them so specifically. We kind of left it open-ended. Why? Because these things, these stones, the process of bringing them from the quarry to the site was not very easy. Parts of them broke. Some of them pushed off. So what we did is when we got on site, we told the stone master or the usta that we wanted to kind of look sort of like this. These were the examples we gave him. And they went about, and we made arrangements about how they should be, like horizontal, vertical, and showing them these renders and these models. And he went, and we kind of interactively worked with part of Biophilic design is working with local materials and crafts. So we came up with these different configurations, right? And these were sliced and diced, so to speak, on site. So we went directly from the quarry to the site and had the master stone craftsman slice these up. This was initially a bigger stone, but we had them slice it up the side. So we create this like more smooth surface. So this smooth versus textured, this is a haptic situation. You can see how it sits here in the park. It's creating a kind of natural element within the architectural design of Saudi Küçüktuna. This is the area where the statue is, seen from that other side. We work with İznik to create these tiles. Now, these are the stone craftsmen that we work with. This was a very big piece of küfeki that we designed. It had a hard time getting here, to be honest. I don't know how the Ottomans brought all these pieces from there because they're not easy to work with. But we were able to create different textures. Also provide a craft element where we wrote the name of Gülbaba. Gülbaba is an Ottoman dervish who lived in Hungary. And this is the end result. We have these, you can see the different, we asked for them to create smooth versus rough. That's something I like, smooth versus rough, because of Biophilic design. Our İznik, from the İznik Foundation tiles in the aperiodic Penrose tiling. This is our design working inside of Pin Architecture's overall. Here they have a fountain, and the statue is by Emre Başoğlu. As a curator, we work with him to, this is Gülbaba himself, to figure out how the statue is going to look, what's going to be holding, because statues and art have these kind of significance. It's set underneath, this is pins as a water element, which is Biophilic. And on the other side, we have the flowing water. So this is our second project at Piyalepaşa. I'd like to thank Adnan Polat and Khan, the general manager, because they really did a good thing putting this together. This involves a lot of, Gülbaba is very multi-dimensional character that I'm glad to be able to be the one that put up his statue in the middle of Istanbul and our design work in stone. And lastly, I work with the GAD Foundation, and one of our new works is out in Cappadocia, and we're working with them now on a project out there, and we're trying to figure out how to use natural stone in different geometries within this landscape. So these are some of our studies, and what we'll be doing here is creating a mix of wayfinding using these kind of shapes. I like to use kind of pure geometrical shapes. These are tetrahedrons, but they're adjusted to tetrahedrons and some polyhedrons. So we're trying to figure out how we can work with stone and create an architecture in stone with these. These are some shots, some research that I've done. I've started over the last couple of months to work with AI more directly. So these are AI-based designs that I've created. I found it very lucky to be able to work with AI. It kind of parallels my work in mathematics to be able to work with AI. So this is our end result here. And right now we're designing these with the GAD Foundation, Gökhan Abcıoğlu and Gizem Geylan, who's the head of the GAD Foundation we're working with to, my relationship with GAD Foundation has been very long-term, and we'll be working on this at the University of Pennsylvania, some of these issues in architecture and stone next year. So these are our initial designs, and now we're making these three-dimensional models of these to be put in Cappadocia in this landscape as a way of kind of bridging art, geology, design, and architecture together, and maybe also putting together, this is more of an artistic piece, some pieces in land art. This is actually something that I want to do, which is, I'm not so concerned with, I want to make it more process-oriented, so it feels like it's geology. It doesn't look like it's man-made. This is something I tried to do back here with these things. Go back here, it's geological, but here I'm going to have an opportunity to do that with these, perhaps a land art kind of configuration in installations like this. It doesn't look, it looks, is it man-made? Is it geological? Is it art? Is it design? This is the whole point of biophilic design, and this architecture and stone in Turkey, because of the architecture industry, is part of our strategy. Okay, so let's see. I think I finished in time. That's my presentation. My work in biophilic design continues, and we can discuss these at some point in the future. Okay, so thank you very much for your time, and if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Thank you very much for this inspiring presentation. Actually, improving the quality of life and self-being through nature and natural elements are my favorite topic personally. And if there are questions, I think we can take the questions from students or from our lecturers. Actually, I have seen there are many students here. Do you have any questions about Arzu?
Hello, can you guys hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Sorry, I'm out right now. That's why it's very loud. But thank you for the presentation. It was very informative. Right now, we're taking 3001 design, and we're designing in a suburban area where there are very large, tall, high-rise buildings, and there are gated areas. So our plot is very empty around it, and since there are these tall buildings, and I'm kind of confused how I can design something that can fit in this environment. Should we in these neighborhoods try to match the material to the surrounding, or as you said, can we bring the nature in here, even though there are these infrastructures that are very different than what I want to design? Does it have to match? I don't know.
No, it doesn't have to. It doesn't have to match. I mean, I think with biophilic design, you're trying to create any connection to nature that you find. So you want to look around. You want to maximize sunlight. And anything that already exists that's natural, you want to make that a feature. So if it has lots of sunlight, maybe you create a wall that captures that sun, right? If there's already some other natural things there, views and sunlight. Sunlight is the most pervasive natural element we have. So I kind of like to start there with sunlight, and then you move on to landscape, floral elements, obviously. But if you can't get that, landscape elements require money to manage. As a designer, then as you can see, what I tried to do was create these ceramics, handcrafted ceramics, and using mathematical principles. So this is you got to be opportunistic. In my Piyalepaşa project, I realized that this was a very dense area, so to create rounded forms, organic forms, this was also, our cities are very orthogonal. As Gökhan always says, 90 degrees. You know, I talk to him a lot about these things. We want to create more organic curvilinear shapes. So basically, you know, you want to be opportunistic, whatever is easy, and then, you know, work with the budget that you have. I mean, you know, sometimes you're given, you know, initially in Piyalepaşa, I wanted to make much bigger stones, but we didn't have that much of a budget, so we made smaller stones. So you have to work with what you're given as a budget, but opportunistically working with the existing elements, sunlight, number one, and then locally what you could provide in terms of, you know, local craft, local materials, local histories, you know, local, whatever is local can add who was there, what's the name of the place. These things are innately biophilic.
So in a way, we can use nature as an element, as you did in your project as well.
Yeah. And stone I use because stone is prevalent throughout Turkey. You can go and get stone pretty much anywhere.
Yeah, okay. Thank you.
Thank you for your question. More questions? Is there any question?
Gökhan, we got you tired, but
yeah, sorry. You know, I throw a lot of information at people because it's complex what I do, but you know, I think it's important. At least, you know, a lot of my students are like, "Oh, you show us too much information," but you know, this kind of stuff eventually gets digested in the brain somewhere. So I'm relying on this long-term impact of all this stuff. But thank you for your time.
And if there is no more question, I would like to thank you, Mr. Karakuş, for your delightful presentation. It's been great having you here. And we have a little tradition here in ArchiDesign Talks. At Bahçeşehir University Faculty of Architecture and Design, we donate in our guest's name.
Right.
And a donation has been made in your name to CEY Foundation, helping underprivileged children for equality in education. And thank you so much.
Thank you for that donation.
And we will share the certificate of donation to you through email.
Thank you.
In the following days. And thank you again.
Thank you Bilgen Hoca. Thanks Murat. It's always
thank you Gökhan. Yes, it
Hadi
was
görüşürüz.
bonding. Bye.
Bye bye.
Bye.